Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to start the fourth unit in the course by looking at unregulated markets. So when you go to a store, okay, oftentimes you will see things on sale, right? And you feel really good about that because you may have had some idea when you entered that store of what you were willing to pay for that item, and you end up paying less than it, right? You feel this gain because you end up paying less than what you were willing to pay. And we have a term for this in economics, and that's called consumer surplus. So consumer surplus, which we typically abbreviate CS, is the maximum price the buyer is willing to pay minus the price the buyer actually pays. So for example, if you walked into a store and you saw a t-shirt you wanted and you're willing to pay $15 for it, but you saw it on sale for $10, then your consumer surplus was $5, right? That's basically what that means is that's $5 worth of gain that you got by buying the shirt for 10 when you're willing to pay it for 15. Again, if something costs $50 or you're willing to pay $50, but it only cost you in reality 20, then your consumer surplus would be $30. So consumer surplus has to be a gain, right? There's no consumer unsurplus, right? So for instance, if you're paying more in the store than what you're willing to pay, first of all, you're not buying it, right? Because if you're willing to pay less than what it costs, you don't buy it, right? So there's no consumer surplus. So consumer surplus has to be a positive number. Now that's it with numbers and words, but what about on a graph of supply and demand? So here's our graph of supply and demand. And for this unit, it's important that we take the supply and demand curves from the axis so we can make complete areas here. And I just screwed up because I called that a demand curve. Look at that. See, even Mr. Schmidt makes mistakes. There we go. So supply and demand. And so then we've got our equilibrium and our equilibrium quantity and then our equilibrium price. And so the question is, where on this graph would be consumer surplus? Well, we can look at it, in terms of one buyer. So we could say, okay, consider buyer A, okay? So buyer A might be willing to pay, let's say, $5 for this item, and we'll say the cost in the store is $2. So the question is, what is going to be buyer A's consumer surplus visually? Well, we know with numbers it would be 5 minus 2, which is $3, but how do we show that on the graph? Well, it's this distance right here, right? The distance between the demand curve, which represents what the consumer is willing to pay, and the equilibrium price, what they actually pay. That's the definition. Same thing for consumer B. If consumer B was willing to pay $4 but only pays 2, the distance between the demand curve and the equilibrium price would be consumer surplus. And so effectively, total consumer surplus, I'm going to highlight it in green here, is the area below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. That's consumer surplus. Now, if we think about this buyer over here, let's say buyer D, I skipped the letter C for whatever reason. Buyer D, if you notice here, they're willing to pay less than what it costs in the store. So buyer D doesn't have any consumer surplus because they're willing to pay less than what it actually costs in the store. So with consumer surplus, you need to be able to define it with words, what we're willing to pay minus what we actually pay, calculate it with numbers, right? So we did it for one consumer, total consumer surplus, okay? In order to find that on this graph for all consumers put together, that's what the green triangle represents. Remember, the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. So we would need a couple things here. So first of all, we would need to know equilibrium quantity. We'll say that's 20 units. And we need to know the price at this bullet here I've just highlighted in green. So we'll say that's $6. So the area of this triangle is going to be total consumer surplus, the consumer surplus of every individual buyer in this market put together. And so that's going to be the base of the triangle, which would be 20, times the height, which is 6 minus 2, times a half. So this would be 20 times 4 times a half, which is 80 times a half, which would be $40. Consumer surplus is expressed as a dollar amount, so don't forget the dollar sign. So that's consumer surplus. Now, of course, it takes two to tango in a market, so we also have producers. So producer surplus is the price sellers actually receive minus the minimum price the seller is willing to receive. So, for instance, if a seller's like, man, I need at least, $30 for my product, but I actually get $50 for it, then I have a producer surplus of $20. If I'm willing to receive $15, but I get $20, then my producer surplus is $5. So it works very similar to consumers, except it's the price you're actually receiving goes first, minus what you're willing to receive. So you're just flipping which one comes first in that equation. With a graph, again, it's going to be the same setup here, and we'll see if Mr. Schmidt can label his curves correctly. Again, I hope you can see why we need to extend them from the axis, because it makes doing this easier. So we'll say this is 20 units. Price of $2. And yep, I think that will do it. So where is producer surplus? Well, let's do it for one individual producer. So we'll say this is producer A, okay, and they're willing to receive, I don't know, 10 cents for the product, but they get 2, right? So their producer surplus would be $2 minus 10 cents, which would be $1.90. But where is that on the graph? Well, it's this distance, right? It's going to be the distance between the price they actually get, $2, and what they're willing to get, 10 cents. And so we could do that for every single seller all the way up until the last seller that pays $2 and gets no producer surplus. So total producer surplus would be what I'm highlighting in red here. It's this triangle. The area above the supply curve and below equilibrium price. And notice we don't go past quantity sold, the equilibrium quantity, because a producer over here wants a higher price, right? Let's say maybe it's $6, than what they're going to get, $2. So they're not going to sell, that producer isn't going to participate in the market because they want a higher price than what the market is going to give them. Same thing with a buyer below the equilibrium price. So to calculate it, same thing. It's going to be base times height times a half. We know that the base of the triangle is 2. So this distance here is 2. The height of it is 20. And again, if you want to switch which one's the base, which one's the height, it does not matter. And then we multiply that by a half. So this is 40 times a half, which is $20. So that's producer surplus. That is how you calculate producer surplus. Now, you'll notice here that the title of this lecture was Unregulated Markets. So unregulated markets are just like all the markets we've done up to this point. They are markets with no government intervention or involvement, right? We've pretty much ignored the government up until this point outside of talking about command economies. And so we'll talk about in future videos what would happen to consumer producer surplus when the government comes in and gets their hands on markets, and sometimes for very legitimate reasons. Unregulated markets are considered efficient because they maximize the sum of consumer and producer surplus. If you leave a market alone, you will have the greatest sum of consumer and producer surplus. It doesn't mean they're equal, as you saw in the example we just did, but it does mean when you add them together, it's as big as possible. In other words, unregulated markets are the most efficient kinds of markets we have. That's what it means to be efficient in a market. You are maximizing the sum of consumer and producer surplus. The name for that is called total surplus. Total surplus is adding consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So pretty simple equation there. Finally, in an unregulated market, every mutually beneficial transaction, so those are transactions where the value of the good to the buyer is greater than the cost of producing the good to the seller, takes place. In other words, everyone who is willing and able to buy the product is able to do so, and every single person who's willing and able to sell the product does so. There are no transactions that would benefit both a buyer and a seller that are not taking place. We will see situations where this is not true in future videos. The last thing I want to do in this video is talk about what would happen if the price of a good changes. So for example, if we go, in a situation like this, we'll call this P1, and let's say the demand for the good increases. So we would draw a new demand curve to the right, and then we would have a new price, say P2. So the question is, what happened to consumer and producer surplus? Well, let's do consumer surplus first. So before, consumer surplus was the area above the price below the original demand curve. So the area above P1 below D, so that would be this area here. Okay. Now you'll notice when the demand increased, now the price becomes P2. Okay, so the price is higher than it was before. And so because of that, I'm going to put it in blue, consumer surplus is now this area. So the question is, what happened to consumer surplus? And while it's a little hard to see based on how I've drawn it here, consumer surplus would have decreased. Why? Because the price is increasing, which means there are now going to be some buyers that get priced out. They can't afford it anymore, and therefore they don't have consumer surplus. Because if you're not buying something in a market, you can't have consumer surplus. Now producers, they're now going to get a higher price, right? So because the price is increasing, producer surplus should increase, right? Because now sellers are getting a higher price, so there are going to be some sellers who before couldn't sell the product because they weren't getting the price they wanted. They're going to come in, and so they're going to get some producer surplus, right? Now, total surplus is not going to change because basically what's happening in this market is some of the consumer surplus is being transferred to producers because of a higher price. So it's important here to understand that when the price of a good changes in an unregulated market, which is what this is, some surplus is going to get transferred either from consumers to producers if the price increases, or from producers to consumers if the price decreases. So it's something you could play around with when it comes to changes in market equilibrium. So that's all for this video on unregulated markets. Until next time, have a great day.